Hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday. I have to think. It's Wednesday. Of course, all days have been the same for the last 2 years. There's no distinguishing. And I sit in the same chair that I've been sitting for 2 years, which I've worn out. But it's Wednesday, January 26th here in New Jersey. And I'm with Dave Wann, and we've been talking for a whole bunch before and then last week. And I'm trying to get out. There's to unpack. There's so much to Dave that I've been looking forward to this for a long time. First of all, before we even go any further, Dave Wann, DAVEWANN.net. Go check it out, folks, because this is one interesting guy who has his fingers on so many different pulses, being an author, and talking about sustainability, being a gardener, being a filmmaker, being a guitarist and a family man. And I probably left a few things out. He's written so much about sustainability. He's going to tell you all about this. We're going to talk about this stuff, but he lives in a sustainability place he helped design. I mean, and he's lived there for a long, long time out in Colorado. So we've crossed the continental divide here. And the latest book, which I'm going to keep showing you all, Tickling the Bear, and the other part, How to Stay Safe in the Universe. It's fiction. It's Dave's first. He'll tell you all about it. His first foray into fiction. He's written so many books about sustainability. Like, this is one of my favorite title books ever, Affluenza. Wow. Overconsumption is killing us and how to fight back. Wow. There's so much here. So this is the conclusion. It's not a real Johnny Carson monologue. And I know you'd appreciate my reference to Johnny Carson. Some of the Gen Zs I interview have no clue what I'm talking about. But anyway, Jay, welcome, and thank you so much for being here, and a little bio, and then we'll jump in.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So just a little, why don't you throw a little background of yourself, just quickly. Where you were born, and you're in Colorado now, just some background.
Okay, well, I've always wanted to be a writer, and and this is going way back, even in second grade, I dictated a little short story about how the skunk got his stripes. And it was a tipped over jar, of course, and it was whipped cream. And my classmates really loved it. I was in the hospital at the time, and they gave me feedback. Hey, that's good. Write some more of these stories. And so, in terms of my writing past, I have moved through the world assuming that my story had something to do with writing. And I worked some odd jobs, very odd jobs, after my undergraduate years. And then I took an SAT test, and it said, David Wann, you are hopeless when it comes to math and science type stuff. Now, you're pretty good in words because you got 98 percentile, and pretty good in analytical stuff too. So like the rest of individuals in the world, I was trying to find my way in the world after having grown up in a suburb of New York City. I decided to settle in Denver because it was so appealing that there were neighborhoods in the city rather than just crammed together people, just millions and millions of people. Now, unfortunately, Denver is sort of turning into that too, but the fact is I've lived now 20 years in the Denver area, 40 years, I'm sorry, in the Denver area, 20 of which I spent in the log cabin, believe it or not, in the mountains around Denver. And I tried to build an addition on my house, being a person who thought, this whole back to the land thing, this is very important that we learn the skills and that we learn how to survive on our own. And I was unable to successfully build an addition on my place because that's not my thing. Meanwhile, I was learning how to write. And then after my master's degree, I went into the placement office and I said, okay, just did an environmental studies master's course. And I've always wanted to write. So do you happen to have anything that would be about writing about the environment?
Wow.
And they said, yeah. EPA called the other day. They want people to write articles, environmental articles on the environment. So that was maybe the first time that I was completely in the right place at the right time.
Wow.
And jumped into the writing that way. Spent 10 years at EPA learning how to do documentary filmmaking, communication strategies, press releases, which always came down to, Dave, we can't really say this, but can you make it sound like, we're doing the right thing? And in most cases, they were. And I loved going out, especially going out on forays on horseback into the mountains, for example, studying the biomonitoring they were doing in creeks and that kind of thing. But that's a long-winded way of saying that my path forward has been blessed with certain little things that happened in a fortuitous way. And about 20 years ago, I joined a group of people who were had the idea of emulating a Danish idea, and that they call it living communities. And what we did is we investigated good pieces of property around the Golden area that I really liked, and we found a property that went for 10 acres for $300,000, believe it or not.
Wow.
And so there was another piece of fortuitous occurrence. And we bought the land, we designed and built, we hired a contractor to do the building. But I'd have to say that probably is my largest single adventure, because it feels so good to have played an active role in the way I'm living my life. We live in smaller houses that are, they're all facing with passive solar energy. They all catch the sun.
How many houses are in that development?
It's 27 houses, and 27 houses where the neighbors have self-selected as people leave. And if people think that they would be a good fit here, we see if they have the money to do it. We see by talking with each other, is this the kind of family we need? For example, we love to have young kids around. So a couple of years ago, we actually had to advise the seller, we can't tell you who to sell it to, but we can tell you we need some kids running around screaming around the neighborhood. And so we actually did get that. So that's maybe bringing a little bit up to speed.
Okay.
20 years of freelance writing while I've been living in cohousing, which has been very nice because I could always focus very heavily on the next deadline and the process of writing, which I love. And then I can go out to the garden and I can sort of unfocus.
Are there any specific things? I mean, you mentioned you came from New York State, but how did you ultimately choose a career in sustainability? It's not a common career. How did that come to you?
Well, hopefully it's becoming more common. I think a lot of young people that I'm meeting, I have helpers in the garden all the time who are volunteering to work, and I've gotten to know the 20 and 30 somethings pretty well. I see their earnestness, and I see that they realize they have a problem. I also see that in many cases they're saying, "Okay, boomer," they're saying, "You guys kind of goofed up," and I kind of try to work against that by listening to what they have to say and so forth. But anyway, now your question was, how did I come to the sustainability thing? And in the 60s and 70s, like many people my age, 70, 73, I experienced some really formative books about the time of the 60s and 70s, including
Silent Spring.
Silent Spring. There was a book called Beyond the Limits to Growth. Actually, at that time it was called Limits to Growth, and now there's a sequel called Beyond the Limits to Growth. There was an Amory Lovin's book called Soft Energy Paths. There was a book that was encyclopedic called Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth. And I digested all these things, small is beautiful. And I said, you know, this is my story. This is what I want to work on. And I believe in this stuff. I see another book with Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich.
I remember that.
Had we listened to Paul Ehrlich, an eminent scientist, and listened to the facts that he was spouting, that if each one of us, as we continue to expand, if each one of us consumes at an increasing rate, it's over. And we didn't listen to him. How do you get involved in people's social decisions? And I hope we can get into that in this dialogue, because I really think it's not necessarily a physical problem as much as it is a social problem and personal story problem, identity problem. I really think that we need to change our story, and some people call it the paradigm, and that's quite easily done. We can change our mind, collective mind, just in time. But we have to form the networks that enable us to trust people in our group. And we need to make a decision on the idea that, wait a minute, you know, this isn't really working. And I think even some of the radical violence that we're seeing is an expression of how it's not working. So we were getting all kinds of messages from nature, from each other, from whatever our faith is. We have to change. And I've called myself a salesperson for sustainability over the years. And I am trying to lay out the red carpet to a different kind of lifestyle that actually produces less stress. And never mind the pursuit of the money and the power. You can have enough of it, certainly, but that's not the goal. The goal is to live together in peace, to have good communities that function well, you know, to trust each other, to have less stress. And I think some economies and countries have already started down that pathway successfully. Maybe we can talk about some of that too. But I think the idea of sustainability has been the central excitement in my life. I realized that I wanted to be a gardener because of that too. And I think I never really wanted to be the guy, the expert, but I found that after having done some work, I certainly feel like I should share some of my opinions and knowledge on this stuff. But that catches you up to where I am now, I think.
Okay, perfect. You did something to me is amazing. You went back, you kind of jump-started your career. You went back to school to get a master's in environmental studies. That is major commitment to what you believe in.
Yeah, you know, there's what preceded that was the idea that all these odd jobs I was talking about, one of which was to go back and get an associate's degree in water and wastewater technology. And what I imagined was that watershed up in the mountains that I was going to help keep clean and so forth. Now along comes my family planning, which wasn't planned, and my son was going to be born. So the first job I could find was in a wastewater treatment plant, where I worked for 7 years.
Wow.
And there was nothing dishonorable about it, but the social implications of it were dire. Because when you have to tell people that you're working in a sewage plant, you either get some humility or, you know, you learn to not care anymore. But that, you know, and that was a good job, 4-day week, etc. But I decided, well, okay, I've had enough of that. I'm going to go back and get my master's degree now. And I was glad I did. I think it did propel me forward. And I went back as I graduated when I was 35. So I was kind of the old guy in the classes, but it was worth it. Yep. I was glad I did.
So you spent a bunch of years at the EPA and you've done so much. Do you have any special like accomplishment things that you did there that we could talk about?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I learned all kinds of writing. I learned how to work with people, to interview them and so forth. But I think the standout things that happened actually were in the area of filmmaking. At the end of one budget year, you know, the federal agencies have some money left over, And my very supportive boss, supervisor said, Dave, you know, you've proven yourself with these articles and stuff, and there's some money. Do you think you could help write a script for a video on hazardous waste? And so I became the associate editor. We hired somebody to be the producer, we did a documentary that became quite well seen by 10 million or more, including Los Angeles at their prime time. And so that was a sort of that was an immediate way to say, okay, well, I know what I want to do on sustainability, not only write, but produce videos. And I produced several others. One had to do with going out on America's best farms, talking to America's best farmers, and asking them every time the same question: what's the best way to grow wheat, or whatever it was? Because I wanted to be the person who knew just about as much as the viewer did. I wanted to ask simple questions, and they would always say, you know what, it depends. You know, and that is a big, very important answer in the way I look at really the world. Things are always changing, and so you can't say the best way to grow wheat this year is the same as it was last year. And so being out on 25 or so different farms all over the country in a TV documentary that was narrated by Raymond Burr, some might remember as, say again, Perry Mason, yeah, and Ironsides and other things. He's a great old guy. We went to have his narration done on his vineyard. He had a vineyard, and by that time he was a good 350 pounds, and with that great deep voice, and very nice to work with. The third video that I did was actually, I got a grant from EPA to work on a project near me in Boulder, Colorado, where they were going to put together a very walkable community neighborhood with that was connected to stores, connected to the bus line, has walkability and gardens and so forth. And that was called Designing a Great Neighborhood. And that actually included a co-housing project as part of the discussion. So that was a great project. One that was a fourth one that was a great video or filmmaking project was a project for Al Gore's office. At that time, he was the vice president of the country, and he wanted to get into the idea that community is very important. And having had some successes in doing short videos on community building and sustainable cities and so forth, I was asked to put together a little video. And it was okay, but they were sort of insisting that I use some film that didn't quite fit in. So it wasn't a great video anyway. And then the catastrophe came when he was on stage at the Brookings Institution, and he said, here's our little video on community building and stuff. And in the early days of virtual presentation, it didn't work. So it sort of flopped in terms of being shown there, and then it even at a second place. So that's all by way of saying you get some, you win some, you lose some. But
right.
That was I thought, quite a distinction to be working for the vice president's office.
Wow.
But then I decided, look, I'm going to write a book. I had read a little inscription by Edward Abbey that said we have to think not only logically, but biologically. And I decided to write a book called Biologic, which I actually. I sort of lost my family for the summer while I was working on this thing to meet the deadline, but they do understand that now, I know that. But the fact is I came up with a little book by a regional publisher that was actually not a great seller, but it captured the attention of some great thinkers, including Amory Lovins, Paul Hawken, William McDonough, people who are on the very cusp of change in terms of sustainability. So I felt like, okay, so I gave them some kind of quirky ideas on how we need to design with nature to protect the environment. And that having to do with everything from packaging to communities, to various products, to manufacturing processes. I came up with some what were then wild ideas, one of which was a light table where you could look at your newspaper on a computer, and then what, 6, 7 years later, again, Al Gore announced we got this super highway coming, and so my idea was really quite primitive. But and then I also talked about a what did I call it? Something mobile, ultra mobile, and that was about the time that people were talking about really making cars efficient, and I gave some ideas on how that could happen. So I think that's the way I began to see that this was what I needed to do, and I was going to even sacrifice my time with my kids that summer to get it done.
Was that your first biologic? Your first?
Yeah. Uh-huh. And the local publisher did quite a job of having only sustainable packaging of the book, and the cover was made out of recycled stuff. And it was really quite a nice effort by Johnson Books, which is now not there anymore. But and so that's my way of saying that I began to think, oh, here I am at EPA, and they actually gave me permission to write that book with my own opinions.
Wow.
But I began to think, geez, maybe I should go freelance, because I know how to write articles now and so forth. And so I did. I jumped ship about the same time. Well, in fact, the same month as I moved into our co-housing community, I also left EPA.
Okay.
And then I began to move down the ladder of success in terms of finances with a lower and lower salary. I kept getting book advances, but the book advances were really only $5,000 and $10,000. You couldn't live on it. And so I was able to do quite a bit of speaking, and I was able to rent out my basement. So that kind of kept me on track.
Are there, you've written a trilogy too in the middle of all this, right? Is Affluenza part of that trilogy?
Well, I call it a trilogy. Officially, it's not, but I
Okay.
did, on the strength of Affluenza, I became, known by publishers who saw my submissions increase as somebody who could speak to the idea of consumption, the fact that we really are over consuming, and really what are we taking away, in a bunch of junk in many cases. So I said, I'm going to do some heavy research, and my favorite book that I've written is Simple Prosperity. It has kind of a clunky title, but it was published by St. Martin's Press, a very large press,
Yeah.
as was the next book in the so-called trilogy, The New Normal. Now, Simple Prosperity got into a lot of the things that we can do as individuals. The most prominent being, we can actually begin to honor wealth that is separate from money. And Simple Prosperity gets into forms of wealth like the currency of nature, the bonds of social capital, the stocks of wellness, that have to do with the idea, if we become better consumer, if we become more disobedient, I think is a good word to put it. If we begin to say, that's not the story that I want to live or tell, then and we find out that really there's two major forms of wealth in this planet. That's culture and nature. And if we protect those two forms of wealth, we don't really need to make a lot of money. And so I'm still excited about the idea of taking pieces of Simple Prosperity and making them available on my website and in articles and so forth, because I think it it gives us a path forward out of this mess that we're in. I remember somebody saying, what's the definition of status quo? This mess we're in. And so I think that if we think about what are we really after? We're after, like I said earlier, a lower stress, a slower way of living, a way of connecting with each other more meaningfully, a sense that there is meaning and purpose in our lives. Then we can begin to say, you know what, I could actually go part-time, and my partner could also be part-time, and we would have a smaller house. And that smaller house would actually be, in some ways, worth more, because I don't have a huge mortgage now. I can fix this place up just the way I want it. It expresses who I am in that I'm not caring about how big my house is.
Mhm.
I want you to care, to give me some degree of respect and status, because I'm actually telling a countercultural story, which goes back to what we were talking about before. I started out as a counterculture person, and I still am. So there are a couple of different metaphors I like to use to explain what Simple Prosperity was trying to deliver. If you think of a backpacker, he or she has a backpack on their back, and they don't have a lot of stuff in that backpack, but they are in contact with nature. They are feeling elevated in a way that they haven't been in years. They feel like, wow, this is it. And yet their wealth is in the nature around them. It's in the fact that they brought a flute to play while they're out there. They have a son with them, like I did in many cases, who was, it was just great to form those bonds. The backpacker really doesn't want a lot of stuff in the pack. What they want is stuff that's going to really be good stuff. So that's, in this world where growth is always the apparent goal, I would say, no, it really isn't. It's not growth we want, it's development. It's a higher quality of the things that we do have. And if you think about the idea that a basketball player really doesn't want to get any bigger, he's already plenty tall enough. What he wants to get is better. Or somebody who is rehearsing a concerto, they don't want it to be, the bigger. They just want to develop it and have it be better. And so in Simple Prosperity and in books that followed, I said, there's a way of substituting these other forms of wealth, culture and nature in particular, and health and leisure time and efficiency, things that really enable us to have quality rather than quantity in our economy. We can get there by actually working together to say, we're kind of turning our back on that now. That's not really cool anymore. And if you look at, there's several economies, Denmark being one, Costa Rica is another. Bhutan is actually, for a time, they base their country's economy on happiness. So I think there are definitely ways that we can make happiness our goal and have enough money be enough money.
Okay. Which is a good segue to this next question, which I like to ask now. I started asking this in recent months. So, do you think we're going to make it?
Well, in the form that we're in now, no. I mean, we've been waiting. I kept saying, well, certainly we won't have to wait until what hits the fan. But I sort of suspected that we would have to. That's what happens in most of the species. They hit a certain place where they hit the wall or hit the fan. And I like to call myself an apocalyptimist. I saw that online, and I think that described it pretty well. My kids even told me that when I sent that little funny thing out to them. That's you, Dad. You know that we're in trouble, but you still have hope, and you still have a certain optimism that it's really not going to do us any good to say we can't make it, because then you can't. Okay, can we make it? How would we make it? We would tell this different story as a species. We would begin to say, geez, this isn't working. We're killing everything off, and as much as we love our dogs and cats, that's happening to all the world's animals. And so I began to realize that I began to see that it's not facts that are going to create that civilizational change. It's emotions, the emotions of pride, conversely, the emotion of shame. It's going to be something that jolts us into realizing where we are. Because right now, we're in this country, we're in an American dream that we need to wake up from. And we, as I think you said in an earlier conversation, we're watching TikTok, and yet that has no content. And so we need to be thinking one way or another. We need to be having it be cool to be doing the right thing. And that involves enrolling our places of faith in the idea, hey, you remember this thing called the Golden Rule? 100 different forms of religion have that as a guiding principle. And beyond that, there's something called the Golden Mean, which many thoughtful, societies grab a hold of, saying it's not just do unto others as you would have done unto me, but as you would have done unto all the world's species, and as you would have done unto all the world's people. And so I think what this reconfiguration is that's going to help us make it is that when we begin to see that meeting wants is not enough. Meeting wants actually is not that satisfying. And in many cases results in disappointment. It results in something that's very unsatisfying. And if we realize that across all countries and across all time periods, human needs have remained exactly the same, and that we are not meeting the needs, so that's why we're not satisfied, and that's why we keep going out and wanting to get the stuff, and it's almost like we want something. And that's it's almost an analogy is I want something, so I'm going to smoke a cigarette. And my analogy there is, having given up cigarettes many years ago, I knew that I wanted to want something. I want to do something.
Interesting.
And I turned it around and I said, it would be doing something not to smoke. And so it's by way of saying that so much of whether or not we make it involves us being able to graduate to a better story. We need to tell a story. We need to tell multiple stories. And one book I'm involved in right now is Paul Hawkins' book, Regeneration, about handling climate change in a single generation. And so it's the idea of telling the story of all these people that have saved the forest near them because it's part of their livelihood. Don't cut those trees down because we're actually woodworkers and we actually can do tourism in that forest. And it's switching the story again and again, hearing very uplifting stories. I think we've had too many sad stories. I think we know we have a problem, but I think we need to be encouraged not to retreat into a cocoon and instead to say, well, what can I do? And not only in my individual life, but how do I begin to help form a consensus that we're going to do something different? I think that this whole fixation on, it's up to the individual and you can make changes, you can not use plastic. And I happen to even be reading this morning that the whole idea that the idea that we're going to save the environment, save the oceans by giving up on plastic and going to the store instead with a cotton bag. The cotton bag, it really is more hazardous than the plastic if you look at the total impact that it has. Sure, we need to get rid of plastic, but my point is, it's not just individual efforts that are going to possibly do it. We really need to be working together and boycott companies. We need to be electing people who have the sense to realize that climate change is going on. And interesting aside on that, I heard Biden say yesterday that Putin, who has his troops, right on the Ukrainian border, he's got bigger problems than that. There were 100-degree days in the far north in Russia, and that whole permafrost, that tundra is melting.
Yeah.
And your country is going to turn into first a big slush pond, and then it's going to turn into a desert. So the fact
scares me that I actually wrote about that in my novel that I just finished. The whole idea of permafrost melting, when those little microbes that have been frozen for thousands of years start flying around the air, there ain't nobody who can predict what's going to affect us.
And what is the title of that again? Your new novel?
It's called "There's a Tortoise in My Hair, the Journey to Spirit."
Terrific.
It's kind of heavy, and it kind of reminds me of Tickling the Bear, which we'll talk about in a minute, only because that has a memoir feel to it, but it's fiction.
Yep.
It's fiction, and I, you know, it's great. We're jumping the gun a little bit, but Tickling the Bear. I read years ago about Norman Mailer, who said for a guy writing a book, a novel, is kind of like giving birth, and you kind of agreed on that. I agree too. You know, it took 3 years of labor. You know, being in labor, the whole quote, the period of gestation, whatever. You know, writing the novels like gestation. And finally giving birth to it. What a great feeling when I sent it to the editor the other day. Before I want to just go off topic and ask you a Calvin question that I always like to ask. So it's a one-word answer, Dave, so it won't take a long time. But excluding family or friends, somebody living or dead you'd like to spend a day with?
Somebody living or dead. You know, even though he was off in a literally mythological tangent, it would sure be nice to spend some time with Joseph Campbell, because he had such a wide grasp of the journey that humanity has been on. And I would like to spend some time with him.
That's a great answer. Great answer. I do want to say DaveWann.net. Also, I'm alerting everybody that there's a couple of music links that I'm going to have here. I did listen to Batman and the Devil a few times before we went on air, and I liked it a lot, and the message was powerful. So folks will be able to click and listen to that. I gave it a thumbs up, which is a very hard thing in this world. Something we can talk about some other time, but getting people to do this, just like getting people to stop listening to TikTok, these are very hard things to do, and I haven't found the answer. Quite frankly, nobody has. So, getting back, do you want to? So let's talk about Tickling the Bear. So this is published. Let's talk about this, and I've got a couple of pages of reviews that I read about this, which I've started to read. And some of the words I took notes on: realistic fiction. It had a memoir feel, and hope, which we need quite a bit of. So what was the how did this come to be? And it was to you like giving birth, correct?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, you worked 3 years, I worked 5 on mine. In many cases, because I was out in the garden, and I'm a great procrastinator. Matter of fact, my joke in recent times has been that my real profession is procrastination, and then I do the writing when I'm taking a break. And but you know what that did, as you probably understand, that really enabled me to be thinking about who these characters are, and thinking about how do they link together, and what would they say if this happened. And so I'm told by those reviewers that you're talking about that the characters are in depth. They get behind that. And I want to double back before I lose the thought to something you said before starting to talk about the novel. And that is that when you're talking about giving thumbs up, it almost seems like that's exactly what we need. We need respect and a sense of status from the people in our life. But it's rigged, so we can't really wish that person well, because it's competition now. You're in the big grown-up world now. You got to fight your way forward. And the idea of status being central that's a good point. But the fact is, there's a different way of having the status and the respect of those people around you. And that's about being smart about something. It's about being generous. It's about being the kind of person who is of service rather than so worried about, making the money and having the power and so forth. But to weave that back into the discussion of the book, that's the kind of person that's in the book. They've given up on the idea. As a matter of fact, one character is a dropout from Wall Street, and another is a dropout from the Silicon Valley area. They both realize that they'd rather be doing something else. So I started writing this novel because I realized that facts alone are not going to do it. Not going to, and my thing is, my passion is to change the world for the better. And I said, so are emotions going to do it? And are people who are good role models, are they going to do it? And I said, probably just as much or more than a listing of all the things that are going wrong. And so this novel, although it involves the guy who's been given a diagnosis that he may not be alive for a year, I wanted to use that device to say, okay, given that, what would a person want to be cleaning up in their life? What would they want to be doing with their time? And so I'm not going to say whether or not he survives, but he's on a hero's journey, and he's a person who is a professor of anthropology, and his topic is future studies. So that was another device I used to say, I'm going to have him say many of the things that when I said in an article, people would say, you're being preachy, and so I let myself off the hook by saying this is exactly what he would say as a futurist. And it seems like the reviewers are letting me off the hook on that for the most part. They're saying, yes, these are things we need to be talking about. And so if you have some dropouts from, the high finance world, and you have a guy who's an herbalist who cures people with the herbs he grows in his own backyard, and also lives adjacent to his son, who he wants to draw into the business. If you have the subject of dementia, which is a personally related thing. I had a partner of 20 years who got dementia. I was able to portray it in a way that discusses that as an issue. There is some LGB stuff in there too, and there are a lot of the issues of our time lived out by these characters. So yes, to get back to your point about did I feel like a father? Yes, I felt like a guy, and it sort of reminded me of my filmmaking days when I would start interviewing somebody and we would agree on what we were going to say, and I would set them loose and they would just go, they would do it, and they would say what they were supposed to say and walk where they're supposed to walk or whatever. And that's what these characters are to me. I let them go, but I'd have to say I was midway through, I was charmed by one romance, for example, that's sort of on again, off again. But they're both really, they're sort of closed up people. They won't let themselves love, but then they do. And I shed a few tears when I brought those two characters together. And so, yeah, I poured myself into that, even though I did a fair degree of procrastination on it.
What I'm trying to spit out now is the notion. I've written 2 novels, and I always found this really hard. Well, what I'm trying to say is, for me, maybe it's for you too. It's hard. It's hard for me to detach myself, and no matter how hard I try, I can't lose myself. So, and what I'm trying to say is, what do I know best in the world? Who am I? The thing I'm an expert in is me. So nobody knows more about me than me. Maybe my wife out there in the kitchen is up there, but nevertheless. So I always, at least in my 2 novels, I can't help but you know, sometimes some of me does drift in, and I would assume some of you drifts in here as well.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Yep. And people ask me, so it seems like you're that person or whatever. And I tell them, well, you know, many of these are stories. And I also reveal that I may not have a second novel in because I used all my good stories up.
You're funny, because I said the same, by the way, I said the same, when I finished this, I said, I think I'm done, you know, I let it all out. I think I'm done, and maybe time-wise, I am done. The last question, because listen, we could talk here for hours more, because I'm so fascinated by your journey, because it's like I want to be you, because
Likewise.
you exemplify, you've done the things that I kind of dream about, you know, the cohousing, the gardening, the guitar. If I could have, I write about that too in my novel. I wish I could have been my character. I wish he could have been a guitarist.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why there's so many similarities. So come back. I told you this before we went on air. Come back and we can continue the dialogue, et cetera, because there's just so much to unpack in the journey and the sustainability. There's a lot of stuff here. So come back. But the last thing, so it's Tickling the Bear, how to stay safe in the universe. What does that mean?
Well, a couple of things, and I'll expound a little here before we finish. But Tickling the Bear was a recurring dream that I had from the time I was a young 3-year-old or something. The bear was going to get in the house, and I would go running down the hallway and tell my parents the bear was coming. Oh no, he's not real. Go, you know, I'll walk back to bed with you or whatever. But to me, he was real because I had to wake up in a sweat to, you know, try to escape from him. And this actually, it wasn't like that dream happened every, you know, 3 months or something, but it happened at least once a year. And there's that damn bear again. And when I got to be 26 years old, I began to have a sense of personal standing, you know, so my personal power was finally emerging. And I said, in the dream, what do they call it, a lucid dream, I said, I'm going to try tickling that bear because I tried everything else. And I'm going to see if that's going to work because I sensed that bear isn't real. So when I tickled the bear, he kind of, oh, I'm sorry, I guess I forgot my manners. And that bear walked out of my life forever. Now it's true, I do have some other recurring dreams about not being effective enough in my life or whatever, but the fact is I've also finessed those in lucid dreams. So the idea of getting over one's fears and moving forward, getting rid of your hesitations, taking a chance, going into it is a piece of that's a major theme of the book.
Okay.
These are people who have their problems, but they're willing to, you know, take a chance and get beyond them. Beyond that, I did want to double back just on the idea. Don't you think, Calvin, that writing a novel is as much about the process as it is the product? If you get immersed in it, isn't that really a pretty good result?
Oh yeah, it's all what a process it. By the way, it's you know, it is a hard thing to do. Of course, you're infiltrated with procrastination. Same here. By the way, I procrastinated. I was nearly done with my novel, literally, and I was diligent, and I worked on it for 2 solid years, and you know, did the outlining. I mean, it was all, and then COVID hit, and talk about procrastination. That was about 9 months of procrastination. I didn't touch it. Seriously, 9 months. But it is hard. It is lonely. It is, if you're into Freudian psychiatry, there ain't no instant gratification.
Well, but I would argue that that if you can get into the zone on a given day, that's gratification, and that if I'm calling out to my partner Ann and saying, "Hey, I just realized what happens here. Mark Blake, determines that they have to go on a bicycling trip to Italy, or whatever, something like that." That I think this idea of being in the process and being in the zone, being in the flow, as one of my favorite books is titled, Flow, is its own reward. And it's a new book, and I'm hoping it gets some saturation in the market. But it is self-published, and I'm not at all ashamed of that. My other books were not. They were conventional. This one was original enough. It was not a fantasy book. It was not a mystery book or a very saucy romance book. So the publishers didn't take it. I said, well, I believe in this book, so I'm going to go ahead and publish it.
Good for you. Good for you about self-publishing. One of the, I write about it also, one of the great elements of my self-loathing is that I have to, at some point, even send out a query letter.
Yeah.
To an agent. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm kind of leaning towards, I have an editor, but I'm leaning towards, so I don't want to send out one query letter because I know what I got here, and I hate that.
Yeah. And it's going to be misinterpreted. What I kept getting from the publishers is, okay, so you write pretty well, but it's not on our list. And if you think what that list is, it's all doom and gloom or fantasy or the same old stuff. And frankly, Calvin, I had to admit to people, I haven't read a novel in 10 years that I could finish because they're just not that interesting to me. And I was having to do a lot of nonfiction reading to write the stuff that I was writing. So my book was, that book, Tickling the Bear, is an original book. It's underived because I didn't copy any novelist. I was a literature major way back when, and I learned how to put a heart into a book and this kind of thing. But it was the only way that could get this out in the world was do it myself.
It is, and by the way, I'm looking at the back. We talked about it before, but hugely prophetic. In the year 2017 BC, before COVID, very prophetic. So I think we're at a great spot. We did our thing, Dave, and I cannot thank you. First of all, I'm thrilled to have met you. And like I said, there's so many parallels to journeys, our journeys. But I mean, I'm on the environmental commission in my town. I don't have co-housing, but just a simple house. But there's so many things about you. That's why I was so magnetized that when we connected, and I had looked forward to this as a beginning of a journey that we can continue to explore things. So I really want to thank you so much for your time and your passion, and getting to know you, and please do come back.
Thanks for the invitation. I will take you up on that, and let's also communicate off screen.
Yes, we will. So we're gonna sign off now. Come back, hang around for a minute or two, and again, thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you, Calvin.